Consider the following sequence of events. In 1945, an 82-day-long battle between U.S. Marine and Army forces and the Imperial Japanese Army was fought in the prefecture of Okinawa. This battle was considered one of the bloodiest in the Pacific and resulted in the death of almost 150,000 Okinawans, roughly a third of the population. Due to widespread destruction and foodstuffs in particular being stolen or deliberately destroyed, a huge number of civilians were left starving and struggled to return to a sufficient diet after the war. Just 4 years later, in 1949, data from U.S. National Archives indicated that 85% of Okinawans' calories came from carbohydrates, with sweet potatoes comprising 69% of all calories, and 1% of calories coming from fish. Then, several decades later, a 2016 paper pointed out that the Okinawans' 1949 post-war diet has a ratio of protein to carbohydrate that is similar to an experimental high-carb diet used to improve lifespan in rodents. Then just this year in January 2019, a BBC article referring to the 2016 paper comes out with the headline, "A high-carb diet may explain why Okinawans live so long." Okinawan people did historically eat their fair share of sweet potatoes, the typhoon-resistant tuber made for a good staple crop. However, is it appropriate to make conclusions about Okinawans' longevity based on their diet right after the war? In any case, when you dig in a bit, it becomes apparent that this 2019 article is lacking some very important context. The idea of this video is to give you some insight into the shortcomings of research in order to help you understand what makes for a weak or strong piece of supporting evidence for this or that health claim. Let's say a detective wants to determine who killed John. He will follow clues and investigate evidence while considering the strengths and shortcomings in each piece of evidence. For example, a witness saying they saw someone that sort of looked like Count Jackington's butler is much weaker evidence than a security camera capturing an image of the butler. It's good to take a similar approach when trying to make conclusions from research. Last year, I picked up this book with the title The Best Diet: Simple and Evidence-Based Guide to Healthy Eating, written by a Dr. Tsugawa at UCLA. I saw this book around when I was making a video on the recent trend butter coffee, and the cover of this book has a big red X next to the word butter coffee, so I picked it up to make sure I wouldn't have to delete my video. On page 31, it says, "Butter is a bad fat, as shown by several studies." Now, the first most obvious step to evaluate a claim is to investigate the evidence that the claim is based on. There's a reference number next to this sentence about butter, so I go to reference 4 in the very back of the book, and it has a footnote saying, "The idea that butter is bad comes from observational studies in which butter seems to raise the bad LDL cholesterol." However, the evidence that butter intake affects your risk for disease is not particularly strong. This footnote goes on to point out that a 2016 paper did not show an association between butter, heart attack, and stroke. This book also brings up another very often debated topic: eggs. Eggs, especially the yolk, can be a cheap source of good nutrients like fat-soluble vitamins, which aren't contained in the majority of typically eaten foods. However, the book recommends limiting your egg intake to only 1 a day. If only this book had come out earlier, then this poor 88-year-old man could have been warned. He ate 20 to 30 eggs a day for 15 years as of 1991. Interestingly, he maintained normal plasma cholesterol, despite the ludicrous amount of dietary cholesterol he consumed. We'll talk about how this affected him in a moment, and we'll come back to why it's being said that you should eat only 1 egg a day. But before we do that, allow me to explain a couple concepts. The first is that of confounding variables. Here we have the grabbing headline, "High-Fat Diet Linked to Anxiety, Depression." If we take a look at the study they're basing the article on, we see that the high-fat diet they used, D12451 from Research Diets Inc., contains 20% protein, 45% fat, and 35% carbohydrate. This is relatively high fat. However, half of the carbohydrate is refined table sugar. By weight, there's almost as much pure sugar as there is fat. So, do you think this might confound the effect of fat? Now, biology is incredibly complicated. There are so many variables that may affect a given output. So, a common challenge is isolating the effect of one food or gene on disease risk from the effects of all the other foods and genes that could also potentially increase that disease risk. I had a chat about the various challenges in scientific research with Eli Lyons, the CEO of the synthetic biology company Tupac Bio. In his current position, and as a PhD candidate at the University of Tokyo, Eli has a decade of experience regularly reading through research papers. Afterwards, I followed up on Skype to ask him about the challenge of isolating variables.
In some of my work, I've done statistical analysis on oncogenes or high throughput mutagenesis. Oncogenes are cancer-causing genes or genes that, when mutated, may drive cancer. Mm-hmm. And what commonly occurs, though, is that in a tumor, for example, you may have many genes that are mutated. And however, not all of the mutated genes are actually driving the cancer. They're not. So the ones that are driving it are called driver cancer genes. And so how do you isolate the effects or determine which genes are the driver cancer genes and which are like carrier mutations or just, and it's also more complex because there may be some interactions between the driver cancer genes and some genes that are mutated, and the interactions are very complex, but the impact may be largely due, the majority of the impact may be due to the driver genes, for example. Mm. And so really it's when, it's isolating how large of an impact or how much of the cancer is due to gene A and a mutation in gene A, and how much of the cancer is due to a mutation in gene B, for example.
This brings us to my next point, the importance of context. A good example for why it's hard to isolate things from context is protein. There seems to be some concern about protein for people on a low-carb diet. One of the goals of doing a low-carb diet is keeping your insulin low. And to achieve that, people replace carbs with fat or protein, but protein, ironically, seems to raise insulin levels. However, does the context matter? Does protein by itself reliably raise insulin levels? If we take a look at this study in canines as presented by Dr. Benjamin Bickman, we see that dogs receiving an infusion of glucose get spikes in their insulin levels when given the amino acid alanine. So it looks like protein does raise insulin. But what about dogs without the glucose infusion? The dogs not receiving the glucose didn't see their insulin change to any noticeable degree. So then, imagine how this fact would confuse the data in, for example, a study looking at how protein affects risk for diabetes, an insulin-driven disease. You might look at how many servings of meat people are having per day, and then look at who develops diabetes. But the physiological effects of a hamburger patty tucked in a whole wheat bun and served with French fries are going to be much different from, say, a steak served only with butter and rosemary. Another good example of the importance of context comes from the work of Dave Feldman. Dave is an independent lipid researcher who has developed something called the lipid energy model. He's actually been interviewed on this channel before. We all know that we are supposed to keep our LDL bad cholesterol as low as possible to prevent heart disease. However, in our interview, Dave explained the logic behind why when it comes to heart disease, LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, isn't all that important in the context of high HDL and low triglycerides. That is, you don't need to worry all that much about sky-high bad cholesterol if your HDL is high and your triglycerides are low.
The NHANES data has certainly been exciting, because while it's true if you look at LDL all by itself, it could be associated with higher mortality. When you look at LDL when grouped with high HDL and low triglycerides, it's associated with low mortality.
This huge NHANES dataset that Dave recently got his hands on is showing that this idea that HDL and triglycerides are more important than LDL cholesterol indeed pans out surprisingly well.
I first removed everybody that had a low LDL. So everyone with 159 milligrams per deciliter and lower, I took out. I went ahead and separated out everybody with HDL cholesterol of 49 or lower. And then finally, I took out everybody above 100 milligrams per deciliter of triglyceride. This was pretty exciting because now I could actually look at what the mortality data was that was left. And that mortality was pretty exciting because not only did they have an all-cause mortality that was lower than the average, but believe it or not, diseases of the heart were extraordinarily low. The youngest person in that group that was left over, once all three of these markers were accounted for, was 68. The oldest in the group, 94. And outside of those two, everybody else died in their 80s. A total of 18 total deaths from diseases of the heart, and almost everyone died of old age.
So, let's go back to that earlier point about the recommendation to eat only one egg a day. The author of the earlier mentioned book explains that, according to a 2013 meta-analysis, those who ate more than one egg a day had a 42% higher risk for developing type 2 diabetes than those who hardly ate eggs. What a meta-analysis does is pile the data from multiple studies together to try and make more accurate conclusions. So here's another point for investigating a claim: the cumbersome task of actually digging through the reference study. So let's look at this meta-analysis that reference 3 points to. Then let's go to Table 1 and see what studies are used for the data on type 2 diabetes. Looking at references 51, 37, and 41, we get these 3 studies. The data from this study did suggest that high levels of egg consumption are associated with increased risk for type 2 diabetes. However, this study found no statistically significant associations between egg consumption and diabetes. And this other study also found no association between egg consumption or dietary cholesterol and increased risk of incident type 2 diabetes. But by taking these 3 studies with differing conclusions and pooling the data together in a meta-analysis, the conclusion becomes, compared with those who never consume eggs, those who eat 1 egg per day or more are 42% more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. At first, this seems like a good idea. More data, so a more accurate picture, right? However, in this study, the women eating the most eggs are smoking the most, eating higher amounts of trans fat, eating 500 more calories per day, and exercising the least. The men who ate more eggs also drank more alcohol and smoked more. The researchers do take these unhealthy habits into account and make adjustments when analyzing the data, but it is very ambitious to assume you can quantify the effects of all things that increase diabetes risk, and then subtract these to accurately understand how just eggs by themselves affect diabetes risk. In any case, the studies used in this meta-analysis are not all adjusting for potential confounding variables. This one only adjusts for age and sex. This one doesn't even account for how many calories the people ate along with the eggs. What if the people eating 2 eggs a day are getting those 2 eggs from a Denny's Grand Slam 7 days a week? By the way, remember the guy who ate 25 eggs a day for 15 years? The 88-year-old had no health complaints, other than poor memory and loneliness after his wife passed away. Also, he had no history of stroke, heart disease, or diabetes. So while this kind of meta-analysis study is a clue to the puzzle of eggs, I think you'd agree it's not as strong a piece of evidence as it appeared at first glance. Of course, the other reason for us being told not to eat eggs comes from the theory that fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. The very first clue for this theory comes from research by Nikolai Anichkov. Anichkov found that feeding cholesterol to rabbits had them develop very high levels of blood cholesterol and atherosclerosis. But rabbits are herbivores, so their natural intake of cholesterol hovers right around 0 milligrams. So let's move on to my next point, the shortcomings of using animals as a model for understanding humans. We were talking about the problems with model organisms.
Yeah. The basic idea is that the mice that they use in experiments are not very diverse, right? So they're kind of like clones. And the way they're bred, it's got like maybe having a breed of dog is the best analogy. So like if you did all of your experiments on golden retrievers, is that really representative of what would happen if you did the experiment on like 10 different dog breeds? Yeah.
To give you a picture of how this can affect research, consider the work of Louis Dahl. In 1963, he fed rats a high-salt diet and found that some, but not all, developed high blood pressure. He then went on to selectively breed rats, producing a strain of rats that were genetically sensitive to salt. Then, in 1970, he fed these salt-sensitive rats commercial baby food, and about half of these salt-sensitive rats died. So he concluded that the high salt content of the baby food was to blame. After his study was published, the US Senate issued a mandate for lowering salt in baby foods. Now think about that for a moment. Does anything sound odd to you about this sequence of events? Anyhow, let's get back to our discussion on mice models.
And well, it's well known that like mice models are not always very good, and the pharmaceutical industry knows that really well. And so it's really easy to, there's a lot of literature on it, but it's really easy to think about, which is, well, one is like, how do drugs get approved for humans? Well, one is they do like early stage preclinical work, which is usually like on cell lines and then on mice, right? And then they move maybe to canines and apes or something, right? And then they start human trials, right? But you may, be familiar that with the phenomena that like, okay, in clinical trials 1, like the drug passed, but it failed in clinical 3 trial. But if you imagine like, okay, if it failed at one of these human-based trials, but, it passed the mouse trial, right? So I think that right there gives you some idea that, well, the mouse model did not model what we expected to happen in human. Why does that happen? Well, mouse is different from a human. And also like the model they make where the mouse has a certain type of tumor, that tumor may not really perfectly model the tumor in humans, or diabetes in mouse might not be the same, like the model they make.
This situation where like you'll pass the mouse phase, but then you fail at the human phase, that's not a rare occurrence.
Not rare at all. It's probably the opposite.
With all this said, studies based on mouse models are still pieces of evidence, not to be completely dismissed whenever we don't like their findings. But we should try and investigate the specifics of why a particular mouse model wouldn't be appropriate for emulating humans.
I guess one of the easiest difference to point out is just that their lifetimes are shorter. So they mature faster, right? So I'm just kind of going through like really easy differences to spot between mouse and human. In my old lab, I was doing some retinal development research, like studying how the eye develops. But like somehow it's kind of a weird model to use because mice are born blind and then like humans are not. So that's kind of odd. So like I guess like these are just some of the things you want to like start to think about when you're thinking, is this a good model to use of humans?
Let's say it's a typical Saturday morning, you've just made your coffee, and are sitting down to read a paper like this one, and you see the words high-fat diet induced obesity. But you are considering doing a keto diet to lose some weight. And you think,
if a high-fat diet is a reliable way to produce obesity in rodents, why would I want to do a high-fat keto diet?
However, we should first investigate if there are some specific metabolic differences between rodents and humans. The high-fat diet for the mice used in this paper, D12492, is 20% protein, 60% fat, and 20% carbohydrate. An actual ketogenic diet for humans would need to be restricted to around 10% or even 5% carbohydrate, but at 20% of calories coming from carbohydrate, this rodent chow is actually a relatively low-carb diet for a human. Now, it's thought that most of the weight loss magic from a keto or low-carb diet comes from lowering insulin and entering ketosis. However, rodents don't enter ketosis nearly as easily as humans. According to Dr. Benjamin Bickman, in rodent experiments, without calorie restriction, to get rodents into ketosis, you need to reduce their diet down to just 1% carbohydrate, 9% protein, and 90% fat. Or even a diet that is 95% fat barely gets rodents into ketosis. By the way, a 95% fat diet would be like an entire cup of butter and about 80 grams or 8 thin slices of bacon for the day. Any more bacon than that would be too much protein. Simply put, the amount of carb restriction that qualifies as low carb or keto for a human does not qualify for a rodent. These are the kinds of specific differences that should be acknowledged when using rodents as models for humans. Let's move on to my next point, food versus compounds in food. We'll start with chocolate. In his book Doctoring Data, Dr. Malcolm Kendrick talks about a headline he saw saying chemicals found within chocolate protect against heart disease. He explains that, according to the research, catechins and procyanidins found in dark chocolate inhibit the enzyme angiotensin-converting enzyme, ACE. When ACE is blocked, blood pressure drops. This is actually how blood pressure lowering drugs work, so it makes for compelling reasoning behind a compelling headline. The only catch is that there wasn't any actual clinical effect. While dark chocolate did result in an 18% drop in ACE activity, there was no actual drop in blood pressure in those taking cocoa extract. Another example is the idea that a compound in such and such food has been found to cause disease, so that food itself must cause disease. For example, there is the idea that heterocyclic amines in cooked meat cause cancer. However, the studies finding that these heterocyclic amines are cancerous were giving rodents amounts of heterocyclic amines equivalent to 1,000 to 100,000 times the normal amount consumed by humans. As this paper says, comparison of the carcinogenic dose in rodents and the actual human daily intake suggests that the latter is definitely too low for cancer production to be explicable in terms of heterocyclic amines alone. One last example is red wine. You've probably heard that it protects against heart disease. This review article from the Journal of Cardiovascular Disease Research discusses the, quote, accumulating evidence that suggests that red wine possesses a diverse range of biological actions and may be beneficial in the prevention of cardiovascular disease. However, if we look at the references, most of them are looking at compounds within red wine, namely polyphenols and resveratrol. One study found that the rat equivalent of 1 glass of red wine worth of polyphenols had beneficial effects against heart disease. Then again, does that mean a glass of red wine itself, with its 200 milligrams of polyphenols and 10,000 milligrams of alcohol, prevents heart disease in humans? By the way, the other compound in red wine, resveratrol, has gained a lot of attention for its promising anti-aging effects. However, one of the researchers investigating this compound has said that in order to get the anti-aging benefits,
the sad news is that you'd need to drink about 1,000 bottles a day of red wine, which I don't recommend.
In any case, the point is, claims like such and such food prevents or causes disease are very different from claims like compounds in such and such food prevent or cause disease. My next point on what to consider when evaluating pieces of evidence is why and from where certain ideas arose. For example, why did people think to start looking at red wine to see if it benefited heart disease? Well, sometime around 1991, people were trying to make sense of the fact that the French ate very large amounts of saturated fat, yet had low rates of heart disease. One idea was that this so-called French paradox could be explained by France's high red wine consumption. So this is what's called an ad hoc hypothesis, a hypothesis added to a theory in order to save it from being falsified. In this case, because saturated fat and cholesterol must cause heart disease, it was assumed that there must be some protective factor in the French diet. Put another way, the logic is let's construct a new hypothesis, red wine prevents heart disease, to explain data that does not support our initial hypothesis, fat causes heart disease. Now, just because a hypothesis is ad hoc doesn't mean it's wrong, but it deserves scrutiny. And what really deserves scrutiny are things that go quickly from the idea stage to clinical practice. An example provided in the earlier book, Doctoring Data, is how a seemingly good idea arguably killed millions of people. From the early 1900s, for about 50 years or so, it was thought that strict bed rest for about 6 weeks was the appropriate prescription for someone who had just had a heart attack. It sort of makes sense. After such a traumatic event, it sounds like it would be best to let the heart rest and keep exertion minimal so as not to stress the heart. And I really mean minimal. To quote Thomas Lewis, a prominent physician from the 1930s, the patient is to be guarded by day and night, nursing and helped in every way to avoid voluntary movement or effort. So, what exactly is wrong with bed rest? As Dr. Kendrick explains, first, lying in bed stationary for 6 weeks means that there is a very good chance of developing a deep vein thrombosis in the legs. A high percentage of these break off, travel to the lungs, and block the arteries in the lungs, causing a pulmonary embolus, an event with a very high mortality rate. In fact, even a several-hour plane flight carries this risk. In 1977, the term traveler's thrombosis was coined for people developing deep vein thrombosis on flights. Low oxygen, low humidity, and low cabin pressure at high elevations, plus sitting motionless in a chair for several hours, is a good recipe for thrombosis. The second issue with bed rest is that without any exercise, and especially after a heart attack, the heart atrophies very rapidly. It becomes weaker and deadly heart rhythms develop, so you are far more likely to die of ventricular fibrillation. Dr. Kendrick estimates that hundreds of thousands of people were dying from bed rest each year, and this approach wasn't being questioned until the mid-1950s. So, where did this idea come from? Well, in 1912, Dr. James Herrick of Chicago published an article titled Clinical Features of Sudden Obstruction of the Coronary Arteries, where he essentially described the first documented heart attack. In that article, he stated, "The importance of absolute rest in bed for several days is clear post-infarction." To quote Dr. Kendrick, Herrick managed to describe the world's first heart attack in 1912, and then, without missing a beat, he immediately knew that strict bed rest was an essential form of treatment for a condition never before described. Another example of seemingly good ideas harming people is that of hormone replacement therapy. It had been recognized that women under 60 had far lower rates of heart disease than men of that age. For various reasons, it became accepted that female sex hormones were what was protective against heart disease. According to Dr. Kendrick, one key piece of evidence, amidst the very limited amount of evidence for this concept, was a 1987 observational study. Observational studies, by the way, are widely accepted to be very weak pieces of evidence in general. Yet the idea was still accepted, so well in fact that replacing the declining female sex hormones in menopausal women became incorporated into the 1992 American College of Physicians guidelines. In the US, failure to prescribe hormone replacement therapy for menopausal women was akin to medical malpractice. Later, a randomized primary prevention trial using hormone replacement therapy involving nearly 17,000 women published its results in JAMA in 2002. This trial found that there was a 29% increase in coronary heart disease risk. Now, I wonder how many women would have agreed to receive hormone replacement therapy if they knew the practice originated from a sort of good idea backed by a weak observational study. My very last point is the circular situation, where existing ideas can influence research in a way that biases the research towards acting as evidence for that idea. So what do I mean by that? Dave Feldman, who we spoke with earlier, has a good example of what I'm talking about.
One of my problems with cholesterol research is it often lumps soft endpoints with hard endpoints. And this can be a bit of a challenge because our existing opinion on cholesterol can make a difference in how the data is recorded. So, to give you an example on the patient side, let's say that you and I have a steak dinner tonight, and then afterwards we both go our separate ways. But each of us that night experiences a 30-minute prolonged chest pain. Now for me, this is the warning I'd been hearing about from my doctor this whole time. After all, he's been telling me about my high cholesterol and that I need to do something about it or I'm going to have a heart attack. Sure enough, when I go to the hospital, it does in fact prove true that I did have a non-fatal myocardial infarction. So all of that data then becomes record. You, on the other hand, did also have a myocardial infarction, but the difference is because your cholesterol has been low, you went ahead and took a Tums because you felt like it was heartburn. Went to sleep, and that data never ended up anywhere inside of the hospital record. That's a big deal if both of us are already part of a study. But this also plays into the hands of medical professionals, because after all, if they would likewise have the same opinion that high LDL is a risk factor just the same as, say, something like C-reactive protein, then that may be relevant for a judgment call on the margins. Certainly a lot of heart attacks that you survive are not on the margins, and most medical professionals would agree. But some are on the margins, and that's a soft endpoint. I like hard endpoints like mortality because they're pretty easy to diagnose. Everyone knows whether you lived or died. And as such, that data is a lot stronger to look at in the long run.
And there are several studies that use the subjective soft endpoint that Dave is talking about here. So for now, this concludes my points on what to keep in mind when trying to determine if a piece of evidence behind this or that health claim is strong or not. I realize some of this can be confusing or disheartening, and that nobody has time to dig through 50 research papers just to decide what to eat for breakfast. But for those of you who want to dig deeper into things to understand what makes us healthy and why, hopefully these points serve as tools to help you analyze articles and research more effectively. The following thought experiment is brought to you by Brilliant. In 1959, the legendary bongo drummer and physicist Richard Feynman gave a talk called "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom," where he imagined constructing smaller and smaller robotic arms until one could write out the Encyclopedia Britannica on the head of a pin. However, real-world limitations make it difficult, if not impossible, to fabricate and operate robotic manipulators at the molecular level. So, what forces of nature might impose a hard limit on how small we can construct a functional robotic arm? A. Molecular scale motors cannot generate sufficient force to move an arm under its own weight. B. At the molecular scale, any arm would likely break apart under the irradiation of light. Or C. A molecular scale robotic arm would move erratically and randomly at room temperature. Want to know the answer and explanation? Check out Brilliant.org, a website designed to make topics like physics, math, logic, and computer science fun and engaging. You can even access the courses offline on your iPhone, so you can learn wherever you are and whenever you have time. Aside from their courses, they have daily challenges like the Feynman one, designed to teach you concepts by getting you to apply them. So, whether you want to dive into courses on topics like computer science, logic, or classical mechanics, or you want to keep your mind sharp with Brilliant's new daily challenges feature, go to brilliant.org/WIL and finish your day a little smarter. And the first 200 people to follow this link will get 20% off the annual subscription, which allows you to view all the daily challenges in the archives and unlock dozens of interactive courses.